ADA 30 Idaho. Interview Series. Tom Olin, interviewed by Mark Leeper.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Leeper. I'm Executive Director of Disability Action Center Northwest, a Center for Independent Living in Moscow, Idaho. Actually, offices in Moscow, Lewiston, and Post Falls, Idaho. And been around the independent living movement for a while, and just tickled to be a part of the ADA celebration in Idaho, and I have been for some time. We process or handle the contract for the Northwest ADA Center Idaho, and our contractor Access Concepts and Training with Dana Gover. And we've been pretty active with the Americans with Disabilities Act for some time. We had a big 25th anniversary a while back, and of course now we're looking at the 30th anniversary. And the 25th, we had Hands Around the Capitol, where we had people gathered down in Boise, Idaho, and collect, and we had a string of people who was just very impressive around the Capitol, and we plan to do that again. But as with so many things this year, Mother Nature kind of shaking her hide and had a little different plan for us. So we're finding a whole lot of celebrations that we're going to be people happily getting together, or people hopefully still happily getting together, but virtually. And so really tickled to be a part of the new Hands Around the Capitol, which will be hands via Zoom meetings and other ways as we move forward. So we're doing a thing to help celebrate. We're actually extending over a period of time, and starting in July, and we'll be going on through into September. But one of the things we wanted to do is, we know there have been a lot of people involved, not only in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act or in circumstances leading up to that, but in Section 504 advocacy and various independent living advocacy all around the country. And we kind of wanted to talk to some of those folks. Recently, we've had a movie come out called Crip Camp that talks about some of the early beginnings of some of the people in the disability rights movement. And that's been pretty popular. So we wanted to kick off our interview series with talking with somebody that appropriately has been recording the history of the independent living rights movement and has been involved in disability rights for a long time. We don't like to talk about how long necessarily. But we're both tickled to have been in the movement for a long time, and he longer than I. So today it's really my pleasure to be able to kick off this Hands Around the Capitol for the 30th anniversary of the ADA with an interview of Tom Olin that will then air on Facebook and YouTube channels for this purpose. You can find them by searching ADA 30 Idaho. On either of those platforms, and I'm sure it'll be aired on others as well. We'll certainly have it on our social media. So again, it's my pleasure today to talk to Tom Olin. Hi, Tom. How you doing?
Well, I am doing fine, and you know, it's kind of funny. I'm actually living on my bus that at another time, or yes, at another time, I might have been at the Capitol with you. So I kind of feel really neat and be honored that I'm in Idaho right now.
Well, and you're no doubt in a little bit more summery weather than if you were in Idaho, because Idaho's having a little bit of a cold snap right now. But then again, the area you're in might appreciate that at the middle of the summer too.
That would be nice.
No question. So, Tom, I want to talk a little bit about your history. You've been involved in the disability rights movement for a long time, but just a little bit of your personal circumstances right now. You're currently living in Bastrop, Texas?
Bastrop, Texas, which is probably about a half an hour away from Austin, Texas.
Okay.
It's a very historic little community. Actually, the RV park, which I have been on for the last 3 years, was a part of a plantation, and it also was a part around here was what they call the Freedom Colonies, which was, as you might know that emancipation came late to Texas. It came 3 years after people were, and so there were groups all around of slaves that still came together and were together in the early part of last century. I was going to say this century, but boy, we're back. Oh well.
Time flies.
And so it's kind of interesting to be. I always love history wherever I go.
Right.
And so I'm in a very red country, in a very right now, unfortunately, with COVID, our governor kind of opened too soon, so we're spiking pretty heavily right now. I was actually on my way to get some supplies this weekend for the first time to get out and go to Austin, and well, now I'll have to wait. Luckily, I've got a neighbor that comes and does the grocery shopping for me.
Good deal. Yeah, it's from one thing to another, and it's just been quite a year. And this kind of takes you back a little bit. You some of your early time. Well, first of all, I wanted to say you went to Northern Michigan University for a little bit of time, but that didn't last.
Yeah, in those days, they did not have any programs for people with dyslexia or learning disabilities. In fact, I don't even know if they had a name for learning disabilities back then. They hardly had one for dyslexia. I happened to knew that term because in high school in grade school I was in summer session of Michigan State University where they were looking into different ways of teaching dyslexia, and I was one of their students as such of that. And so I knew the word before most people knew the word.
Yeah. But no rights at that time, right? I mean, you didn't
No rights at
either
all.
sink or swim.
Yep. And I sank. Yeah, it was kind of funny because I thought I was going to be a teacher. My father was a teacher, and I was in Future Teachers of America. And in high school, I learned how to get good grades. I did oral reports, and
Mm-hmm.
they did not allow that in college, And so I was and I'm glad in one way because I ended up I would become a teacher. I don't know what kind of teacher I would have become, but through all of this, I ended up working in a rehab hospital. And that's where I also got into a lot of other disabilities. It was a Mary Free Bed Rehabilitation Hospital in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I still have some friends from that era that came in in fact, there was Diane Coleman. She was doing spinal fusion. Back then, spinal fusion was there. You were there for months to rehab. Nowadays, it's less than a month. But Diane Coleman, who later on became famous for Not Dead Yet.
Sure.
But that was, I was on a floor I was 19 years old. She was 17 years old at the time. But other people, persons that were on that floor were my own age too. And so it was really high drama because there were mostly a lot of quads, a lot of paras that were coming in right from the hospital, from the traumatic injuries. And it was just like, it was either I want to die or I want to live and fight on, and it was high drama. And it was like years afterwards, I finally said, that was somewhere. I ended up on an island in Brazil, and the only one that spoke English. No, the governor spoke English. He would have me over a couple of times a month. But otherwise, I missed the language, so I started to speak and to myself. And after a little while, I started to answer myself, and so I said, gave myself those questions of where do you want to do? What do you want to do? What has brought you, to this point in your life? What fork of where do you want to be? And I said, okay, I want to get back into disability. And this was 1980. And so I decided, okay. And when I went back, I could go anywhere, And so, of course, 1980, you say, I'll go to Berkeley. And so
What's happening there?
yeah, I spent a year in Brazil, but and then afterwards I went back to Arkansas, which I had lived there for a while, and I had some friends, and we decided to go to Berkeley or to the Bay Area together, and that's where I also picked up my my photography, but I was also connected with. At that time I was able to be an attendant, and so I was an attendant at Berkeley at the SIL in Berkeley, and also at disabled students program, which at Berkeley University of Berkeley, and that's actually where Ed and the Quad Squad came from. They were students. They were young students that wanted accessibility in the dorms and in their programs, and so they got that. They got together and was a little power group, and got the college to do as much as they could. But what they were doing, they were also saying, well, there's other people around, and there were actually. It was like a little SIL inside of a university, and then the university said, no, you can't do that. And so that's where they went down, and Berkeley SIL became Berkeley SIL from that.
All the time.
But I was there later on after that, and became an attendant and worked in different areas. Became very interested in the disability politics of California, and learned my skills of photography. My first exhibit was actually a client of when I was an attendant. She was had chemical sensitivities, and at that time I was a person that never used deodorants, or I didn't have any chemicals on me that way, and so I was touted, for being an attendant that way. But after I realized, though, this is the early '80s, and actually the movement, the IL movement, was in the IL movement, and there's just the IL movement and the disability rights movement, and they have origins that were connected, but then they went their different ways. And one of the political ways was the state's California Association of the Physically Handicapped, they called it back then. And I wanted more politics, I wanted to be involved. And so I ended up moving from there to LA, where Diane Coleman, we were both out of Michigan, and we were spending summers together. So we decided, okay, things were happening down in LA. We had Paul Longmore, Ann Finger, Carol Gill, this disability studies program, was being promoted, and everything was, disability culture was happening up in the Berkeley area as well as in LA. Barbara Waxman, one of the first feminist disability writers. I mean, it was so fun to be around and creating language that that someone would say something and say, oh, hey, let's say it better. That, yeah. So we're disconstructing ableist language for our own language, into our own language. And it was exciting. And then, we're doing little things like accessibility at the universities there, and Doug Martin and other real interesting leaders around, and curbs, and but what really sparked Diane and I is when ADAPT came to town. Mike Allberger and Wade Blank came to town, and they said, we'll be coming down to LA pretty soon. And so we said, okay, that sounds just like what we might want to do. And when I went at the first demonstration, I only had one row of 24 black and white pictures, and out of those 24,
Back in the film days.
those back in the film days, and yet that row probably has about 6 photos that are, very iconic. It was just pretty amazing, and just, of course, from then on, I was just kind of hooked. It was not. I was more interested into getting it out to the local people, because no one had seen these pictures. I mean, no one. Finally, and then after I was getting that, then Mary Johnson and also Mainstream, just, we're looking for photos like that for the rest of the U.S. and the disability community. And so that was happening. You couldn't live off of that. But luckily, Diane had a really good job as commissioner in the Department of Corporation. So I also was in special ed in LA. I was temporary. And so I could, anytime I didn't want to work, I didn't have to work. I could do the photography. I could go to places. That's kind of how I started in the movement, was taking photos back then.
Well, and you've taken a bunch, and you've kind of taken them all over the place, and kind of some images that we've gotten to know really well. And in fact, I think we can also see them on the Smithsonian. I think some of the photos that in their history, disability history project, and so on.
Yes.
It's pretty cool.
Yes. I love when that happened, because it was just, and when I got to see it, I also saw a family that had no idea that the exhibit was there, but they had a child using a chair, and they go by it, and it was just like, kid was just amazed. I mean, it was so, he was speechless. He could not believe that part of him was there, and that, I got to see that happening in a lot of different places. One of my favorite stories is when I was in LA when I worked as a aide in a special ed school. I had they'd take me to different schools, and this one, there was one kid, the only kid in a wheelchair in the whole school, elementary school. He must have been probably in 4th grade. And so they had a program that morning in the auditorium. And so I'm taking him to the auditorium because I was a one-on-one person with him. His one-on-one was sick, and so I took over that week for him. And got into the auditorium, and the guy said, okay, you can't go any further. You got to be right by the door. And I said, why? He's a fire hazard. It was just like, oh my gosh. It was just, luckily, I always took with me a book with all my photos, a lot of my photos, these just big pictures, so I could just, and so we came back from the auditorium. He sat down, I sat down, and he opened up the photo book, and the first page, it had it was from a San Francisco demonstration with ADAPT, and he sees a picture with like 50 people in wheelchairs, and he just looked up at me and said, I didn't know there were that many people in the world that were in chairs. And of course, he never sees them, And then he turns the page, and Time Magazine had called Adapt Wheelchair Warriors. And he just looked, he saw that Wheelchair Warriors, and he just smiled. And just he looked up and said, I can be a warrior too. You know, and that's that kind of thing that made me become who I am and what I do forever. You know, I want to get those places out. And yes, the Smithsonian was a really nice, and what I really like too, I have photos and at Little Rock High School at their, I love civil rights, at Lorraine Hotel. You go up into, they have one floor across from the Lorraine Hotel, the place where Earl Ray actually shot him from, and it's a 3-story building, and the second story is all about other movements that that had happened from the civil rights movement. And you open the elevator door, and right in front was like a 5 by 7 foot photo of Adapt and people with disabilities at an action. I was just right there, you know. And so it's important that people get to see us as a civil rights movement. It is really important. I mean, even people who I remember on the bus running into a place in South Carolina at an independent living center, and I had this display out for their staff. I mean, for their board of directors, and I had a African American that was at a company, and you know, he a big company there, and he came and he looked at him, and he just said, I had no idea. I mean, even though he was there and with a really great independent living center that they have there, but he did not make the connection until he saw the photos that at some, you know, it reminded him of their civil rights movement. And that is so important for people to get that, because our movement, our civil rights, the ADA, did not come easy. It was a movement. Over 1,500 people were arrested, put in jail, sometimes 5 days at a time, quads in a jail for 5 days. I mean, that's life-threatening. And so, you know, it was, you know, we fought for this. You know, it wasn't given to us. I think I think they didn't know when we were passing this ADA. I don't think they really understood, and you could see it today, because we would never have. It would never be passed today. But down the line, you know, when we did get to DC for the final of the ADA, and we made a difference that kind of shook, you know, the House and the Senate at that point. Getting ahead of myself there.
Well, it all kind of ties in, right? Well,
Yeah.
it all ties in, right? It's we're talking about the ADA, but it started well before that. As you mentioned, you graduated or you got out of University of Michigan in 71, I think was Northern Michigan. But and then all that transpired, and then back in 80, but a whole lot happened in between then, right? I mean, we had the thing in San Francisco, the sit-in, and which I felt like has really made it when it got on Drunk History.
Right.
So, you figure you've made it once you made that mainstream.
Yeah.
But it was Section 504. People were fighting. I think one of your photos that we'll look at in a moment certainly talks or speaks to that effort to try to get regulations for Section 504.
Yeah.
And so it was miraculous in a sense, as you say, that we got to the Americans with Disabilities Act and actually extended this thing that covered federally funded folks, sort of, with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And we said we wanted more, and some things happened.
Right.
So our first, actually, I wanted to stop though before we go forward. You've got a photo behind you that it's we've got two gentlemen on the end. One, no one wants a nursing home, it says, and there's another one, and then there's people in between nursing homes or jail. Where's that
Yeah.
photo from?
Well, after living in LA, Diane and I moved to Tennessee. Actually, we could move anywhere. We got a map out and we said, okay, let's find out where the worst place is for services for people with disabilities. And Tennessee was one of the worst, and it still is pretty bad. And in fact, it's so bad that when we were living there, we did this underground railroad from people to get out of Tennessee to different other states. One of the big states that got a lot of people from Tennessee was Colorado. You had Atlantis Community there that got a lot of people from Memphis, Tennessee, especially. But that was the picture behind me is from a Medicaid demonstration at the state capitol. Not on the Capitol, but in Nashville at the Medicaid office. But that's a little after the ADA, and we were definitely wanting to. I mean, services was a big thing. If you if you didn't have services, you could never get out of a nursing home or
Exactly right.
Or, community living was not a big thing back then.
This was after the ADA, and so of course that brings us back to we needed to get the ADA, and it happened that probably one of the most iconic photos, I think that so many people, I know a lot of centers end up with that on their wall. In fact, if I was to turn my computer a little bit, you would see it on
Oh, yes.
It's in our conference room, and it's often called the Capitol Crawl. And it's an image of there's one person going looking like scooting up backwards, using their arms to scoot up backwards. Another person kind of crawling up the steps beside them, and above at the top of the steps, framed in the sky, is the Capitol. Right. So what's going on there? How did you get there and talk about that photo?
Well, before I forget, that's Sheila Jackson from Georgia, and that's Tommy Malone from Kentucky. One of the neat things about ADAPT and a lot of organizations that did come were from all over the United States, and thank God we had Justin Dart go around not only once but twice to every state. ADAPT had affiliates in a lot of states, and so when they met twice a year, you had people from all different places. Now that happened. What was happening in Congress is that they were having conference, which means that both sides of the House and Senate come together. They don't do this very often, but they were together to kind of do what they could do or get out what they wanted to get out. And one of the neat things that happened was that as a community and different organizations, and especially ADAPT, when they wanted to, when they were saying, "Oh, this epilepsy is not a disability," or AIDS, we're not going to take care of that. We held fast. And at that time, disability, and still is today, we're considered a minority. We have high points, as you say. Crip Camp was a very high point for us, but. We were very strong. That crawl up started actually at the White House. They didn't crawl from the White House, but we had a march from the White House, and the march had a lot of great people. Evan Kemp was in it. Justin Dart was there. One of the iconic ladies that did crawl up was a niece of mine, Jennifer. She was a little girl that crawled up this step, but she was being pushed. Actually, my mother was pushing her, so I even got to take a picture with family in it. It doesn't happen very often, but so we marched to the Capitol, and then we had a lot of great speakers. We had a rally. There was Pat Schroeder from Denver, Major Owens, I. King Jordan. We had Miller. We had Paul Miller. We had some really great people that spoke. Mike Auberter, and then after the great speeches that we had there were a group of people that decided that we had already decided to crawl up those stairs, those steps, very symbolic. And it was kind of interesting because they didn't want the kids to do it because, the Tiny Tim effect. That was kind of interesting. But thank God that the kids did it anyhow, and where were we? Okay, we had the crawl at, anyhow, the crawl was interesting also because it was really, no one knew it was going to be what we considered the shot that was heard around the world. And to that point, I had a person that came in from Paris a couple of days later, said they had seen it on Paris television. And it was, and at that same time, the senators and the representatives were listening, we're hearing about it. And so it was making, they knew what was happening on the outside. And not only did that happen that day, but the next day, we people thought we were going to be taking a tour in the Capitol, and so at different times, different people would come in, and we all met at the Rotunda. And at that point, the tour guides, just said, well, after seeing all the mass of disabilities, you're not really here for a tour, are you? So, no. And so we had a protest in the Rotunda, which is illegal if you start chanting. And of course, we started to chant. And when we started to chant, the vibrations went to every part of that Capitol. Of course, meaning that every senator, representative was hearing about it. And we had some of them come down and they would make a little speeches a little bit, and then they speak real slowly and say, okay, do it louder and louder. Everyone is hearing that, you're doing great. So it was very, very, very interesting.
Fascinating times.
And we had, over 104 people were arrested. We locked down the Capitol for 8 hours, which is, I'm sure you can't do that anymore. I mean, it was definitely, they felt our pressure. They could feel our pressure. And it was really great that we had the ground. I mean, what we had out there, and what was so nice was that the groundswell of advocates and advocates, we're together and doing something together. Mm-hmm. And it's something that, we have to put that history out there because we need it today. We need that today for sure. Right now, 4 months ago when Crip Camp took us to a high point, so high, we just thought, oh my gosh, Sundance is doing, getting us right on target. And the Obamas were a part of it, and then the next day COVID hit, and we were on the bottom. We were so much on the bottom that our reps in DC weren't even listening to us. They had more problems. We were we were not a priority, and we had no, we didn't have anybody that could say stop. We didn't have people in the government that said, we needed to be spoken for. And here we have the government is saying, 40% of people in congregate living situations, which we know are most people with disabilities. And that's 40%. We're saying every other country is 60%. So it's probably around 60%, but that many people dying, and we don't have any say about it, and that's going to have to change, and we're going to have to all come together somehow. We've got to show that power again, or it can happen again.
Well, I think that's where that history is so important, right? And taking a look at some of these things. How do we get there? And you talked about ADAPT. ADAPT has been huge. They were Americans with Disabilities for Public Transportation. At first, and then they changed over because the transportation started to kind of get there. We had the ADA.
Yeah,
and then
got the ADA. And what was interesting about the ADA, and because we ADAPT thought for transportation, everything that the ADA said, they had timetables, but the timetable for transportation was, as soon as it was signed, that was it. That's how powerful you can be. All the other ones had, a year or so to get it together, But
you've got a couple of photos about that. I think one of the ones we've included is a group of people in front of a Greyhound bus, and one a chair user, second from the right, "We will ride," it says. And I see one person there, there's a boom box sitting on their feet in the wheelchair. So all the wheelchair users in the front. But this was related to that transportation access. Do you remember that photo?
Yes. That was in St. Louis, actually. And one of the, ADAPT went all over the U.S. Anywhere that the American Public Transportation Association went, we went. In fact, they thought they could get rid of us when they went to Montreal, Canada. We went to Montreal.
All right.
But it was one of the targets in every city, because every city had it. They always had a Greyhound bus terminal, and it was kind of, you stop one bus, and that was actually in I think the second day, or maybe it was that day when we hit Greyhound. It shut down, not shut down, but it slowed all the routes, all from the East Coast to the West Coast, because St. Louis was the center, and so it made a difference. And even though Greyhound wasn't a public entity, it was a private owned, and they were adamant about, it just cost too much. It just, they would say anything they could, and they would kind of lie about it. They would, and when you buy a bus, you're buying it for about 20 years. And so if you took the aggregate average on that, it doesn't really cost that much. And so that was definitely a big fight, and one of the other photos that you really like is the one with the two guys underneath the Greyhound bus.
Yeah, that's the next photo. It has the picture of the tire and the faces, people right under the bus. Yeah.
That was in LA. And that was at a time when what was really kind of neat about the struggle for the ADA was that not only was it just this one place that could do it, that was actually a national day of protests throughout the U.S. There were 8 major cities that were, and some other smaller towns that would demonstrate against Greyhound, and it was not the safest thing to do because they kept those buses are running. They don't stop them. They're diesel buses, and they don't stop diesel. So every once in a while, somebody will say, "Gosh, I miss that diesel exhaust," because they'd be sitting in behind for hours.
That's pretty major stuff. It was successful. But you talked about all those marches and that the demonstrations, and ADAPT has been doing that. And I think our next photo is it shows a number of people, a large gathering. We shall overcome. And there's a person with a guide dog in the center of the photo. There's a young person on one side. It brings to mind the protests currently, the Black Lives Matter protests, as you talked about, human rights issues and so on. Talk about the similarities you're seeing. And of course, obviously, I feel like there's crossover because disability crosses all boundaries, and
it does.
Discrimination, painful across boundaries.
Right. And definitely you can see it in the congregate, living situations. You can see it in prison, and there's more minorities in prison. There's more minorities in, percentage-wise in nursing homes and in state hospitals. Minorities are a very bulk of a lot of that. You think of prison, but you got to also know that there are so many people with disabilities, and it also includes people in the homeless area too. They're of color and also of with a lot of disabilities, and we definitely, just like right now with a lot of with the police happening, the defunding or whatever, trying to make a new police force. Well, a lot of that is saying, we want the community to be involved. We want the community to be a community police, and we want, in the independent living movement, we want the community. We want to be a part of the community. I mean, that's such a big thing, and we realize that. Now we've also realized that we've always known. I mean, one of the things that after we had the ADA, ADAPT especially, went right for getting people out of nursing homes, out of those places. That's over 30 years of them trying to get that done, and we really realize how bad that has the GLA just came out with an infection report of 82% of nursing homes have been cited for infection. I mean, it's just like, well, this is just hotbeds of that anything could happen, and there's such a bias. I mean, of going to a nursing home and instead of the community, and we know by reports and by a lot of research that the best results are in the community and not in nursing homes. So I think everyone is like trying for a new infrastructure. I mean, we definitely in the disability world need an infrastructure, because we need to have gatekeepers that won't allow us to be in this position, when so many people dying within, not only in the congregate settings, but we have people that are out in the community that are that attendants they don't have PPEs, they don't have, some of them aren't coming to their to the persons that they're working for. I mean, and it really shows you also that they should be really paid a great wage, a good living wage, because we need good people, and we need more. We definitely need more. I mean, it's turning back so much. The scab is being torn off of so much. We're also realizing that housing is a big issue. Also, you get people out. We got a couple of great instances where people are ready to get people out of nursing homes. They've got the hotel rooms, they've got everything ready. If we have regulations that we can't even get in to talk to the people and ask them if they want to live outside of that. And of course, we're up against a pretty big industry too. Not only are we up against the nursing home industry, but we're also, even the unions are kind of not for community living.
Sure.
So it's a this is a fight that that we all have to come together. Not just the people that, I love the independent living movement because we have a lot of diversity. We have the opportunity to be so diverse, and yet we still haven't, we haven't reached out to the psych hospitals. We don't have enough people in play for people to get out and live in the community. There's a lot we have to, really, it's going to take as much as it took for ADA and the struggle for the ADA. I think it's going to take just as much struggle, to get us out of this, this, whatever it is called, the COVID era, the COVID, Black Lives Matter. We just,
the key is advocacy. Get together and you can make things happen. And there's nothing that shows that more than the last photo I believe we have, which is no, not the last, the second to last. I'm sorry, because we do have something else that shows the continuance. But the second to last is a photo that actually appeared on the publication of the federal regulations related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's a picture of some folks sitting around, some notable people I'll let you mention, sitting around President George H. Bush as he signs the Americans with Disabilities Act on the White House lawn. And who's that with him, and where were you? Obviously right in front.
Right, right. I had the opportunity to be with the press, or I had an opportunity to sit down with everybody else, and I chose to sit. I was probably like 4 rows back or something from this. Like you said, there was 30,000 people, 33,000 people there. And of course, on the left, you had Evan Kemp, which is one of the unsung heroes of the ADA. He was in the administration. He and his wife, Janine, got to eat with Bush and talk about the ADA. Actually, of course, on the right is Justin Dart, we consider our father of the ADA.
Right.
But what was interesting with them both is that they kind of knew that something like the ADA was going to happen. And Justin, came from a very Republican family, and Evan came from a very Democratic family. So they kind of crossed. They realized that they could do more if they crossed over, and it didn't.
Working together, what a concept!
Yeah. It was. There was a lot behind the scenes, and they could play us. They could play the movement, out. They knew us. Evan. I remember once we were being hauled out of where was it? Atlanta, at the Atlanta Federal Building, being just pulled out in the rain, and Wade Blank called Evan, and he told him what was happening. Well, Evan called the senior counsel of Bush, because they were bridge partners, and so he called Bush right away, and Bush called down and said, "Let those people go. And if it's raining out, get them back into the building." And we slept overnight in the building, But we had great people. We had great people that could work the Hill, but it was the people, the grassroots that really made it. If it wasn't for the grassroots, I don't know what would have happened.
Really
that's what
amazing coalitions.
it was really great. It was kind of what was funny about the whole scene was that, people came out of the woodwork, and it was just like, we never had 3,000 at the, protesting at that time. Later on, we actually had 4,000 at a Olmsted rally um, 9 years later, when we, got the Olmsted. But 3,000, it was like, where were you when we needed you on the? But it was a great celebration. It was really, the Kennedys were all about that time, and you had both parties were there, Dole, and yeah, it was and definitely Tom Harkin was, a standard bearer for us.
Tony Coelho.
Tony, God, you could just go down name by name, and
Yeah.
we had some really. It was great. It was, not only great for us, but like I said, it was a shot that around the world they heard about this and envied us, and a lot of things happened, in different parts of the world because of that, of what we did.
But what we found, so we got the ADA and it was passed. And then of course we had regulations coming in. And as you said, transportation happened right away, and not without its pain and so on, and implementation, as is always the case. But others, there was a little bit of a delay. And some of what we started to find then was, once the regulations were out, was how were they interpreted? And so we started to see some cases that went in that were summarily dismissed due to an inability. One of the issues was proving the presence of a disability. We'd long said that mitigating circumstances shouldn't be counted. The courts didn't pay attention to that. So it came about that we felt it was worth opening up the Americans with Disabilities Act again to try to get some of these things amended so it could have the teeth it was intended to have. I think by certainly those that fought for it, but I think by those that passed it as well. Because they certainly came out in support of what became the ADA Amendments Act. But you became very involved, and our last photo is part of a project that you were involved with. And of course, it kind of carries on as with a lot of excitement now. In fact, you mentioned it when we first started talking. We have a photo. It's a long bus. Speaking of buses, on the side, the wrap says "The Road to Freedom, Keeping the Promise of the Americans with Disabilities Act." And there's a website, www.roadoffreedom.org. And you're standing there with a couple of folks I'll let you introduce in front of the bus. And so what's the story here?
Well, the people that are in it besides myself is Janine Bertram Kemp, the widow of Evan, and her live-in, David, and Fulton, and that was the second. This is the second round. Actually, at this point, the second round became, we're going to do it. I'm doing it forever. The first round was created. The idea was interesting. It was created. The idea was out of a gathering on Dan Wilkins' farm up in Toledo, Ohio, and we had Roland Sykes, we had Jim Ward, and Tim Harrington was there. I'm missing so many. Janine was there. But I know I'm Debbie Flether. I wish I could go back and visualize that one. But on through that, we realized, actually Roland and I said, okay, we're going to do some buses, and Jim Ward was there too. He really got the idea. We said he could see the idea really well, and of course, down the line, Roland did get his bus before we got our bus, and unfortunately, he died before we could actually come together. but we all knew that we had to do something with what was happening. It was you could just see that something had to be kickstarted again. And so definitely Jim Ward did really got us. We got together. I mean, then became just Jim and I and Janine and Debbie Sweater and their kids. Actually, we had 2 buses the first time, and it was Debbie and Jim and the 2 kids. And then I was in the other bus, which was all wrapped up in my photos, which that was kind of neat to go around it, till you're in the photos. And that was, we hit every state, and actually even flew with our pictures and flyers to Hawaii and also to Alaska.
Awesome.
So we hit every state, and then and it worked. I mean, there was a lot of people that we had people signing in and making sure they got to their representatives, and it was and people were signing in a long piece of parchment to give to the representatives in DC. It was very much like us doing the same route that Yoshiko and Justin did, years before. And I still, every time I go, in fact, the new one, started a year before, the ADA of 2015, and it lasted after 2015 until 16. But the day of the anniversary, or the night of the anniversary, in that bus that you see, I had a pajama party, I guess I could call it that, with Janine Bertram Kemp, Yoshiko, which both the widows of the signers of the ADA. That was fantastic, and I mean, that was, and then we took off that morning, and we had a rally in Wilmington, Delaware. Went from Wilmington to Baltimore, had a rally there, and then we went from there on the day of the ADA. Went to the Smithsonian, had a their ADA celebration, and then that evening we hit the Kennedy Center for their ADA. That was quite a day.
Oh, that, wow.
But on the second, I mean, I really, I took a lot of time on the second round. I had the bus is accessible, so I had people with disabilities riding, Robin Stevens at times. We had different people and drivers. I had different drivers. Some of them were actually we had a vice president Nickel. We had a director of disability, developmental disability, DDPCs. Well, anyhow, I mean, at different times, but it was really neat. There's a lot of people really owned it, and the bus became iconic. I actually made a comment. And I said, well, if anything happens to me, just bury me in the bus, and a few days later, the Smithsonian calls and said, no, we want the bus afterwards. don't do that. I'm sure it was a joke, but it was, it became, I mean, there were people stopping us. And when we were stopping at, for gas, that would, come over to us because they knew about the bus. And sometimes we'd be at a rally, and people, families would come and say, we drove 100 miles to see the bus for our kids, and it became, you realize that there's not that many things out there that we can, in our culture that we can grab a hold of and actually feel and touch and be a part of. And that bus became that part. And I got to be in it. I got to be a part of that. And I'm still, I'm on the bus now. It hasn't gone anywhere. I almost got it. I realized this year that it was going to take too much money to get it together and running again. So I almost had a sponsor. I was actually just within the week, I was going to have a sponsor and a new bus, and COVID hit. COVID hit, and it was just, oh well. So
Yeah.
I still will do that. I still think it's one of the things that I'm meant to do.
Well, it's a powerful, powerful image, and just that sense of people uh, being willing to get out and fight for something, and the power that it has, as you mentioned before, of that young man who went through and saw your photos of when you suddenly see, we actually have a board member as he watched Crip Camp. It made it all real. And even though he'd heard the words, because I always say them a lot, but that sense of that history, and history can mean so much. And of course, history is living. We have a lot to do yet. Obviously, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, this thing we're doing now was unimaginable, right? I mean, my goodness, this was Star Trek stuff, where you'd actually be talking and having an image.
Yes.
And so now the ADA didn't really cover a lot of that. How do we make that accessible? We've had 508, which covers some of those things, but it's still Netflix by the 9th District was found not to be a public accommodation. So there's a number of things that we have to do to continue to improve accessibility. And but as you said, probably one of the most critical things right now is keeping people safe and continuing to put in place things that allow people to get into the communities and live the lives they want to live, which is really what the ADA was all about, right?
It is. No. ADA is a living document, and definitely we've got to do more on that. Because this is why we're at a point right now that is not so happy, in a sense of we shouldn't have the problems that we have. So, and then we need a stronger Olmsted for sure. We just need, we just kind of thought things were going to, fall into place. And so we had other things to do, and we just really need to get back to our basics. We need to definitely have a stronger ADA and a stronger Olmsted, beef up L&L. We've got to do things. We've got to, it's definitely a living document. We've just got to breathe more into it.
You take heart from the amount of effort and interest and advocacy that's taking place through the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, April, and their youth groups, and the National Council on Independent Living, Nickel, and their youth, about intersectionality, the support of Black Lives Matter, Black Disabled Lives Matter, and all of those things. Do you feel like those are kind of coming together to give a boost right at the moment too?
Oh, yes, I definitely. I see it, and I mean, just 3 weeks ago, or I can't remember how long. April did a Zoom for transitioning, and we had over 200 people, on that Zoom. That's amazing. That's how much, people are really wanting to do something. And there's some great programs out there. There's people are doing some great things, and some of them are being done by young people. I love it. There's a program out of Atlantis community in Denver, Anaya there, Robinson, who is trying to get people out from the nursing homes into hotel rooms, but and then the workers, he's working with the homeless, and they're educating them and teaching them how to become workers. I mean, so things are, good, neat programs are happening. There's I love what Shauna out of Triple up in Pennsylvania She's working. One of the things that we were talking about was housing. Well,
Hmm.
she's doing a program of tiny houses for people to get out when they get out of nursing home, and they can actually buy them. Down the line. I mean, there's some really great things that we need to share, and definitely one of the best ways to share is through Nickel and definitely April. And, so there,
Well,
yeah, there's.
and through some images, which you're still taking photos, but not with
I
film.
am. No, not with film, and actually my big digital. I've kind of, the last time I took photos, I actually used my good iPhone.
Uh, the changing world of
It
photography.
still works. It still works. Actually, I was in Kansas, and with now I could be on the other side of the line. They needed medicated expansion, so I stood in the way of the Senate hearing bill. I mean, Senate chambers. Got arrested. But I took pictures too.
Yeah. You and everybody else, you've got a lot of competition now in the photography world with
Yes,
cell
yes,
phones. Thank goodness, because it's certainly shedding some light on a lot of issues and
yes,
giving some power
yeah,
to people and so on. So,
yeah.
well, Tom, it's just awesome talking to you. I could sit here and chat all day long, but I suppose
Yes.
in the interest of people that are going to watch our conversation,
Yeah.
we probably should wrap up. But I thank you so much, and who knows, maybe we'll talk again. I think there's some folks we plan to talk to, so maybe
Oh,
they'll
great.
rope you in to join in on one of those calls. But it's much appreciated, and just make sure you take care of yourself, huh?
Well, I definitely feel honored to be with you all, and in Idaho, definitely. And I'll take care. You all take care, and we'll survive.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's well, thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Image of a word collage in the shape of the United States, the main word being access, and hashtag thanks to the ADA.